John Carpenter's The Thing started as a maligned gore fest in 1982, but more than 4 decades later, it's now recognized as a touchstone of horror and sci-fi. Even directors like Quentin Tarantino see the value in it, and like all great pieces of art, The Thing also has several amazing stories and facts behind its creation, and in this video, we're going to explore the 50 most insane facts about the entire The Thing franchise. That said, before we begin, please consider hitting those like and subscribe buttons. Those 2 small clicks from you will help us tremendously in bringing you more of these marvelous videos. And now, let's begin, shall we? Remake of a 50s sci-fi classic. John Carpenter's The Thing can actually be considered a remake. It was inspired by The Thing from Another World from 1951, a campy sci-fi film that Carpenter loved as a kid. In homage to that movie, Carpenter copied that film's title sequence effect, and if you look close, you'll notice that The Thing's opening title appears to burn through the screen exactly like the 1951 version. Prequel, not a remake. 2011. Almost 30 years later, Universal wanted to resurrect The Thing. Rather than remake Carpenter's classic, which the producers felt was already perfect, they chose to do a prequel set at the Norwegian camp. As producer Mark Abraham put it, remaking The Thing would be like painting a mustache on the Mona Lisa. The 2011 film, which was confusingly titled The Thing as well, depicts the events at Thule Station, the Norwegian base, right before the 1982 story. Interestingly, they struggled with what to call it, and every subtitle they brainstormed, like The Thing Begins, sounded clunky, so they just stuck with The Thing. Yeah, it's a bit confusing to have 2 different films with the same name, but at least it's not a mustachioed Mona Lisa. Norwegian warning spoils the plot. The 1982 film begins with a Norwegian helicopter pursuing a dog across the snow. When the frantic Norwegian passenger shouts at the American camp, he's actually giving away the entire movie. In Norwegian, he yells, "Get the hell out of there. That's not a dog, it's some sort of thing. It's imitating a dog. It isn't real. Get away, you idiots." Of course, none of the Americans understand him, so the poor guy gets shot and his spoiler goes unheeded. The scrapped Burning Man intro. Early drafts for the 1982 film had a very different opening scene. Originally, the Norwegian helicopter chase would end with the pilot losing control and crashing behind a mountain. One survivor, on fire, was to stagger into the American camp after the dog. Carpenter scrapped with this over-the-top idea, calling it cliché after cliché, and opted to start with the mysterious chase as we know it today. A realistic thing that fooled the watchdog. Now, here's irony. The fake dog Thing was so realistic, it fooled an animal welfare observer on set. The American Humane Association had representatives on site to ensure the animals were well treated. When they saw the grotesque, half-transformed dog Thing puppet thrashing and dogs yelping, one rep became alarmed, thinking the filmmakers had somehow harmed a real dog. They had to assure her that the contorted kennel abomination was just latex, rubber, and KY jelly, not an actual husky that had been shredded down to pieces and ripped apart like it was in a slaughterhouse. That's how convincing Rob Bottin's practical effects were, even in person. Stan Winston's secret contribution. Makeup wizard Rob Bottin designed The Thing's outrageous creature effects at just 22 years old, but he didn't create the first monster we see. The kennel creature that erupts from the dog was actually made by effects legend Stan Winston, brought in to help Bottin, who was exhausted from his previous werewolf project. Winston's team built the horrific dog Thing puppet and even used reverse motion photography to make its writhing tentacles look like they whip out violently. Bottin joked, "If I have to do another mechanical dog, I'll go nuts," so Winston gladly handled this iconic scene. Shadow Imposter. Identity unknown. To preserve The Thing's paranoia, Carpenter keeps us guessing with who gets infected first. Remember the scene of the husky dog wandering down a hallway and into a silhouette of a man? Carpenter deliberately used a stunt extra, not any of the actual actors, to cast that shadow. That way, even the most eagle-eyed fans couldn't identify the silhouette. Well, that's because it's nobody. This clever trick maintains the mystery of which character the dog Thing infected. Real dogs, real terror. Do you remember the kennel scene's chaos and the dogs barking in fear as the thing revealed itself? Well, it sounds so scary, intense, and real because it was very, very real. Sound designer Colin Moat rounded up several stray dogs, put them in his house, and threw on a trench coat and creeped around outside, tapping on windows to spook them. The dogs freaked out, barking and howling, and those recordings became the panicked animal sounds in the film. Needless to say, no actual dogs were harmed, just thoroughly scared for art's sake, and okay, maybe they were momentarily traumatized, but we're sure they were fine in the end. Carpenter wasn't the first choice. Universal Studios didn't immediately hand The Thing to John Carpenter. Producers David Foster and Lawrence Turman initially pitched it to Texas Chainsaw Massacre director Tobe Hooper, whom Universal had under contract. Hooper did try to work on the film so much that he wrote two wildly different drafts, but the studio hated both and ultimately went back to Carpenter. In hindsight, Carpenter was perfect for the job, but it's crazy to think that the film nearly took a very different direction. I mean, could you imagine if Tobe Hooper got the job? It would have looked so different from what we actually got. We're not sure if it would have been worse or better because that's not our job as a neutral party, but it would be different, of that we're sure. In fact, our next entry is about just that. Tobe Hooper's bizarre version. So what was Hooper's failed take? For one, his alien didn't assimilate or shapeshift at all. This guy just outright ate people. He envisioned a campy horror comedy where the main hero was an obsessed sea captain type hunting the creature, which would remind you of Captain Ahab hunting down Moby Dick after it bit off his leg. Anyways, in Hooper's version, there were slapstick gags like a character slipping on a banana peel during a chase. Producer Larry Turman said Hooper's approach would have been one of the worst movies ever made, so much for that. Carpenter wisely steered The Thing back to tense sci-fi horror. Actually, in hindsight, we think Hooper's version probably would have sucked if it wasn't done in an exceptionally specific manner, and unfortunately, there goes our neutral party status. I mean, come on, a banana peel? Yikes. Jed, the wolf dog MVP. The dog that appears so many times across Outpost 31, of course, isn't CGI. It's not even some random pet or a stray. It's a very real animal actor named Jed, a hybrid wolf dog. The Thing was Jed's first movie, and he was 5 years old during filming, and his commendably calm performance, from silently wandering the halls to staring at people like it's observing them in order to learn something new about them, became the stuff of legends as far as animal actors go. Cast and crew noted Jed's 1,000-yard stare made him perfect as the lurking alien in disguise. Jed would go on to appear in films like White Fang before passing away in 1995, but of course, between you and I, he's the father of the immortal dog Thing. However, we gotta remind you that this half-wolf, half-malamute calm beast wasn't the dog seen in the first scene. That's another one that was painted to look like Jed. Open mic trash talk. Carpenter is known as an actor's director, and here's a story why. On set, actors David Clennon, who played Palmer, Richard Masser, who played Clark, and Thomas Waits, who played Windows, once privately griped about Carpenter turning down one of their scene ideas. They didn't realize their lapel mics were still live and Carpenter had heard everything, including being called a prick. Instead of blowing up, he walked in laughing and said, "I heard what you said, guys. My reasons for not doing the scene still stand. You're right, though. I am a prick." The cast burst out laughing. Carpenter's good-humored handling of the situation won their respect and diffused any tension. Kurt Russell's personal touches. R.J. MacReady is a quintessential Kurt Russell hero, and Russell himself added subtle details to the role. For instance, to realistically show frosty breath in the frigid setting, Kurt would take a drag of a cigarette right before cameras roll. He did this to ensure that his exhalations were visible on cue. In the scene where MacReady and Dr. Copper explore the Norwegian camp by helicopter, the pilot actually lets Russell try the controls mid-flight, and you can see the chopper wobble slightly on film when Kurt briefly takes over. Little things like that make MacReady feel more authentic, if a tad reckless. MacReady almost wasn't Kurt. Before casting his friend Kurt Russell, who wasn't yet a huge star, Carpenter and screenwriter Bill Lancaster considered some heavyweight actors for MacReady. Lancaster wrote the character with Harrison Ford or Clint Eastwood in mind, but they were probably not even approached. Nick Nolte and Jeff Bridges both turned down the role, and the studio even met with a young Kevin Kline. Alec Baldwin auditioned too, but ultimately, Carpenter convinced Universal that Russell, with whom he'd done Escape from New York a year ago, and the TV movie Elvis, was the right pick. It's hard now to imagine anyone else trading flamethrower barbs with a shape-shifting alien in the snow. The only woman is a computer. The Thing has an all-male cast of characters, which was intentional. Carpenter wanted to focus on paranoia within an isolated group of men and didn't want any other angle to surface, especially one that would make things seem relatable or comfortable, so there were no women on screen at Outpost 31, which was a bold choice for a horror film in 1982. The only female presence is the voice of MacReady's chess computer, provided by Carpenter's then-wife, actress Adrienne Barbeau. MacReady promptly calls her a cheating bitch when he loses a chess game and pours whiskey into her circuits, so it's not exactly a romantic cameo. This makes Barbeau the voice of the film's sole female character. MacReady's hidden backstory. Though never stated outright in the film, Carpenter and Russell developed a backstory for MacReady that explains his hardened loner demeanor. MacReady was envisioned as a former Vietnam helicopter pilot who experienced a traumatic incident that left him disgraced. He suffers from PTSD, insomnia, and alcoholism, and that's exactly why you can see him sipping JB whiskey all day. Although we must admit, JB is a fine choice. This backstory isn't explicit in The Thing, but it gives extra weight to details, including his heavy drinking, his calmness amidst chaos, and the line, "I'm a real light sleeper, childs," and all of this says that MacReady has seen hell before. No wonder he can cope with an alien apocalypse somewhat coolly and strategically. Windows named himself. The radio operator character, played by Thomas G. Waits, is nicknamed Windows in the film, and that's because he's always wearing shades. That detail actually came from the actor. During rehearsals, Waits showed up with sunglasses and declared, "I want everyone to call me Windows from now on." Carpenter chuckled and went with it. They even changed the script to adopt the nickname officially. Sure enough, Waits keeps the shades on almost continuously until he's brutally assimilated, which only makes Windows a memorable moniker in the team. Oh, and if you think about it, Mac and Windows went on to become two words that changed the tech space and industry forever. Mac, of course, being short for MacReady. Antarctica in LA. Despite its convincing frigid setting, The Thing wasn't shot in Antarctica or anywhere near there. Interior scenes were filmed on a soundstage in Los Angeles in the middle of a hot summer. To simulate icy cold, Carpenter had the sets refrigerated down to about 40 degrees Fahrenheit, which is equivalent to about 4.5 degrees Celsius. Outside, it was over 100 degrees Fahrenheit or 38 Celsius, so those puffs of breath you see on screen are real, and the actors were genuinely freezing on set, while just beyond the walls it was sweltering. Some exterior scenes, meanwhile, were shot on a glacier in British Columbia, giving the film its authentic snowy landscapes. Benning's death was a late addition. In the original script, Bukes simply discovers Benning's missing, and we'd infer The Thing got him off screen. Editor Todd Ramsey found that confusing and asked Carpenter to clarify the creature's pathology. In response, Carpenter added the memorable scene of Benning's being assimilated, the one where Windows finds him outside with freakishly distorted hands, and Bennings lets out an inhuman scream. This visual of a half-formed thing proved to be a smart addition and clearly demonstrated how the creature absorbs and imitates its victims. The chest chomp trick. The defibrillator sequence, when Norris's chest becomes a giant mouth that bites off Dr. Copper's arms, is one of horror's greatest gags. Here's how they pulled it off. For the wide shot of Copper's arms getting chomped, a real double amputee was hired to play Copper. They fit him with prosthetic gore arms made of wax bones, rubber, and jello, as well as a latex mask of actor Richard Dysart's face. When the chest jaws snapped shut, the fake arms detached, appearing to bite off the doctor's limbs. In close-ups, they cut to Dysart himself reacting in horror with his real head above a fake chest. It's seamless movie magic with an amputee actor, a dummy torso, and editing all combined to make us, and probably the poor on-set medics, believe we'd just witnessed a man's arms being violently severed. Rob Bottin gave 200% and paid for it. The film's young special effects prodigy, Rob Bottin, literally worked himself to the brink creating the creature effects. Bottin was only 22 and so dedicated that he practically lived at the studio, working 7 days a week and upwards of 20 hours a day. He later recounted having horrific nightmares about the creature designs. Eventually, exhaustion caught up with Bottin and he was hospitalized with severe exhaustion, pneumonia, and a bleeding ulcer by the end of production. Luckily, he recovered, and the insane practical effects in The Thing stand as his crowning achievement. Monsters on fire. Bottin's stress wasn't just due to the long hours. there were disasters as well. During the filming of the famous Norris Thing autopsy scene, Carpenter wanted real fire in the shot. Unbeknownst to the effects crew, the creature model's materials were flammable. When they lit the set's edges, the entire constructed Norris Thing burst into flames and burned to ash. That elaborate puppet had taken months to build, and it was destroyed in seconds. Bottin was horrified, and they immediately set his team to rebuilding it from scratch. Amazingly, they reconstructed the creature in just 1 week so that filming could continue. AIDS, Cold War, and The Thing. Beyond the gore, The Thing tapped into real-world anxieties and social problems of its era, which pretty much makes this movie more than just a horror movie with blood, death, and gore. You see, during the early 1980s, the AIDS epidemic was at its peak, and critics later noted an undeniable parallel between the movie and the disease outbreak. The Thing was also an invisible infection that could only be identified by a blood test. Does that sound familiar? Carpenter has acknowledged the analogy. Others see commentary on Cold War paranoia and McCarthyism in the film. The idea that anyone could be the enemy in disguise, sowing distrust among peers, resonated with those mid-20th century enemy within fears. Whether you read it as social commentary or not, the themes of mistrust and hysteria certainly struck a chord beyond just alien goo and tentacles. Major changes from the novella to the screen. We do know that The Thing is based on John W. Campbell Jr.'s 1938 novella Who Goes There, the same story that inspired the 1951 movie. Carpenter's version is actually much more faithful to the source material than the 51 film was, which took a lot of liberties for various reasons, including cinematic as well as financial. Having said that, John Carpenter's The Thing still had several tweaks and cuts. Firstly, Campbell's story had 37 scientists at the outpost. Carpenter trimmed it down to 12 core characters. Of course, having 37 men meant a grander story and more expenses. Next, in the book, there were no Norwegian researchers. Naturally, that whole prologue with the Norwegian camp as well as the entire events from the 2011 prequel movie were invented for the film. Lastly, the famous blood test scene is actually the climax of the novella, whereas in the movie it comes earlier at the end of Act 2. That said, we're happy to say that Carpenter's streamlining paid off. By focusing on a small group and upping the ambiguity, he translated the novella's paranoid atmosphere to film while keeping the creature's identity-hopping concept intact. Morricone's ominous score. Ennio Morricone, the legendary Italian composer known for The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and other classics, scored The Thing. It was a notable collaboration, of course, and Carpenter usually composed his own synth-heavy scores, but here he brought in Morricone for a more orchestral and, shall we say, professional touch. Morricone produced an eerie, minimal score, and Carpenter reportedly told him after listening to some tracks, less notes, to achieve the sparse feel. Interestingly, Morricone's work on The Thing earned him a Razzie nomination for Worst Score in 1982. Ouch. But decades later, parts of his unused Thing music were repurposed in Quentin Tarantino's The Hateful Eight, and Morricone won an Oscar for that. Poetic justice for the maestro. But you know what? This also tells us about how the Razzies might sometimes simply follow trends instead of actually being authentic. I mean, we know that The Thing bombed at the box office and most critics treated it like the plague, so yeah, but let's move on. The blood test fake-out. The film's most heart-stopping scene, that is MacReady testing blood samples with a hot wire, actually owes its effectiveness to a sly editing trick. When MacReady finally gets to Palmer's dish, the blood itself leaps out at him and reveals Palmer as The Thing. Carpenter set up that jolt by secretly swapping in a prosthetic hand. Kurt Russell did the close-ups of his hand looking at the petri dish, but 2 shots before the jump scare, the film cuts to a fake hand in the same framing. We subconsciously get used to this prop hand, so we're not looking for the cut. Thus, when the blood creature bursts out, it catches everyone off guard and likely made a few viewers jump out of their seats. Kurt Russell's flamethrower prank. After filming the scene where MacReady torches the Palmer Thing and an unlucky Windows, Kurt Russell decides to give John Carpenter a scare. He showed up the next day on set with his face and hair completely wrapped in bandages and told Carpenter dead serious, "I've been burned. I can't finish the scene. I got hurt by the flamethrower." Carpenter went white with panic. After a beat, Russell ripped off the bandages dramatically and yelled, "Ah, perfectly fine." Carpenter was relieved and probably wanted to strangle Kurt Russell. 50 technicians, 1 monster. The final creature in The Thing, often called the Blair Thing, after it assimilates Wilfred Brimley's Dr. Blair, was an absolute behemoth in every way. That giant monstrosity bursting out of the ground required around 50 crew members to operate the puppet and effects. It was so complex that initially Carpenter toyed with using stop-motion animation for parts of it. He even commissioned a few stop-motion test shots of the creature emerging from the floor, but in the end, only a few brief stop-motion bits made it in, and Carpenter stuck mostly to practical puppetry for the climax. The result is a massive, grotesque finale thing that's 100% old school, and yes, with just a tiny hint of Harryhausen-esque stop-motion if you look closely. Explosive finale, literally. To film the destruction of Outpost 31, Carpenter's team built the entire outpost camp outdoors in British Columbia and then blew it to smithereens. Yep, that's what they did. They rigged the buildings with explosives and gallons of gasoline so that when MacReady tosses a stick of dynamite, boom, the whole camp goes up in a fireball. The explosion was actually much larger than Kurt Russell expected. If you watch that scene, there's a shot where MacReady flinches and throws himself aside for real as debris flies past him. In fact, the blast was so big the crew had to stand a mile away during detonation, and they still felt the heat. One charge detonated slightly late, causing an extra kaboom that startled everyone who thought the danger was over. Fortunately, all the cameras survived and captured the fiery ending in one take. And yeah, this meant that they had to shoot the entire thing in one take without the luxury of reshoots. Lost Carnage, aka Knowles' death. You ever wonder what happened to Knowles in the finale? He wanders off screen and then just disappears. Originally, Carpenter planned a much more gruesome end for him. A deleted sequence had Knowles encounter the thing underground. He would scream as tentacles enveloped him, and then a giant tentacle would erupt through his chest, killing him. They even started shooting it, but time ran short to complete this complicated effect. When a rough cut of the scene made a test audience giggle, perhaps because it looked too outlandish, Carpenter decided to omit Knowles' demise entirely. So poor Knowles simply vanishes in the released film, presumably assimilated off-screen, and thus leaving his fate to our imagination. The ending, its ambiguity, and theories. The Thing's ending is famously ambiguous. In fact, we believe it's one of the most ambiguous endings ever. So we have MacReady and Childs, half dead, sharing a bottle of whiskey as the camp burns, neither sure if the other is human. Carpenter deliberately went for this uncertainty and actually replaced a more clear-cut ending that the script had. Over the years, fans have concocted many theories about who might be a Thing. One popular theory is that MacReady hands Childs a bottle that's actually filled with gasoline from Molotov cocktails, and Childs drinks it without noticing, meaning Childs is the Thing. Carpenter, however, has neither confirmed nor denied any theory. He shot multiple takes of that final scene, including one where it was obvious that neither man was infected, and a take where that was more uncertain. Ultimately, he chose mystery. Actor Keith David once quipped at a convention when he said, and I quote, "I don't know about Kurt, but it sure as hell wasn't me." And yet, the truth remains unknowable, which is exactly why we're still talking about it all these years later. Hated in 1982, loved later. Believe it or not, The Thing was an absolute flop when it opened on June 25, 1982. It grossed only about $19.6 million on a $15 million budget, and critics savaged it. Famous reviewer Roger Ebert called it a great barf bag movie and blasted its characters as superficial. Starlog magazine sneered that Carpenter was better suited to directing traffic accidents than sci-fi horror. Cine Fantastique ran a cover asking if The Thing was the most hated movie of all time, and the director of the 1951 original, Christian Nyby, said, "If you want blood, go to the slaughterhouse." All in all, it's a terrific commercial for J&B Scotch, referring to MacReady's drink of choice. Ouch. Thankfully, time has been kind to The Thing, and it's now revered as a genre masterpiece, proving that initial reviews aren't everything. Carpenter vs. E.T. Bad timing. One big reason The Thing bombed was just the timing. Summer 1982 was stacked with sci-fi, and just 2 weeks earlier, Steven Spielberg's E.T. the Extraterrestrial had charmed audiences worldwide. Moviegoers were in love with the cute, friendly little alien, and they weren't in the mood for grotesque, paranoid alien movies where everyone dies. You see, audiences weren't looking for a gruesome killer monster so soon after falling for E.T. To make matters even worse, The Thing opened the exact same day as Blade Runner, another dark sci-fi film that initially flopped. The Thing came out against the wrong competition and the prevailing audience taste. Of course, both Blade Runner and The Thing later became cult classics, but in the summer of '82, they were twin box office disappointments. Continuity was king. The 2011 prequel filmmakers went to extreme lengths to ensure everything lined up with Carpenter's film. Director Matthias Van Heiningen Jr. was a huge fan of the original and kept a laptop on set loaded with hundreds of screenshots from the 1982 movie to use as reference for sets and props. Remember the axe embedded in a door that MacReady later finds? The prequel shows exactly how it got there. You see, a character swings an axe at the creature and leaves it stuck in the door, and Mary Elizabeth Winstead's character Kate yells, "Don't touch it," so the axe remains for the Americans to discover later. They recreated the two-headed corpse, the split-faced thing, in freshly killed form, so it could later appear charred in 1982. Even small set details, like the locations of burnt holes, bloodstains, and the ice block, were meticulously matched. This obsessive continuity earned the prequel kudos from hardcore fans, and yeah, although the story had several issues, the Norwegian camp looks exactly like it should, and in doing so, the prequel paid its due respect to the original, and for that, the movie has our respect. The prequel's leading lady. Unlike the testosterone-fueled 1982 film, the prequel introduced a strong female protagonist, Kate Lloyd. This was a deliberate echo of Alien's Ripley, inserting a capable woman into the alien carnage. The irony is that Kate ends up surrounded by Norwegian and American men who largely panic or distrust her, which is a nice inversion of the 82 all-male dynamic. Interestingly, in the Norwegian camp crew, there is one woman, Juliet, among the Norwegians, which is one more woman than in Outpost 31. MacReady's brother. Early in development, one draft of the prequel concept focused on MacReady's brother at a different outpost leading up to the events at the Norwegian camp. Universal even hired Ronald D. Moore, who is famous for the reimagined Battlestar Galactica, to write a script along those lines. Ultimately, that idea was scrapped in favor of sticking directly to the Norwegian station storyline. Van Henningen came on board as director once the project firmly became What Happened to the Norwegians, and Moore's version was discarded. Still, it's interesting that there was consideration of expanding the MacReady family lore. When practical effects met corporate panic. Just like 1982's film, the 2011 prequel originally used extensive practical creature effects. For instance, lifelike animatronics and prosthetics made by Amalgamated Dynamics. Early footage showed impressively gross practical monsters, but after some negative test screenings, Universal panicked that ADI's animatronics looked too 80s for modern audiences. In a controversial move, the studio ordered most of the practical effects to be replaced or enhanced with CGI. The result was that nearly all the wonderfully crafted puppets were painted over with digital versions in post-production. Alec Gillis of ADI said their designs remained, but much of their physical work was digitally replaced. Fans were upset, and frankly, the CGI creatures didn't look as convincing. Years later, Van Henningen admitted that this was a mistake, saying that they were caught in a transition period and said that the thing's CGI didn't measure up to the old-school techniques. In his own words, "We made the wrong decision. I regret it now." Heartbreak on ice. The crew who labored on those prequel practical effects were crushed to see their work erased. ADI's founders, Alec Gillis and Tom Woodruff Jr., poured love into those monsters. After release, Gillis revealed how demoralizing it was to have their creature puppets deemed obsolete. In fact, Gillis and Woodruff were so frustrated, they later crowdfunded and made their own all-practical monster movie in Harbinger Down in response. And writer Eric Heiserer, who wrote the prequel script, said the CGI overwrite broke his heart. He had envisioned the prequel as a showcase of modern practical effects, just as the original had been in 1982, only to watch studio execs digitally smother that vision. The lost ending with pilots. The prequel's finale wasn't meant to end only with chasing the thing and blowing it up. An entire alternate ending was shot, and it had Kate venturing inside the alien spaceship. There, she was to discover the frozen, partially dissected bodies of the spaceship's original alien crew to be called the pilots, and it was these guys who had been killed by the thing they picked up, either knowingly or unknowingly. The idea was that the thing was an organism those aliens found on another planet, which then infected them and caused their craft to crash on Earth. Kate even finds a pod chamber with one pod broken open, cluing her in to what went down. In this original ending, an animatronic alien pilot was built by ADI, and Kate Kate had a confrontation where she realized the pilot sacrificed itself to stop the thing. However, after the studio's reshoots, this complex ending was scrapped. Instead, they inserted a simpler CGI sequence of shifting Tetris-like alien machinery and a last-minute CGI creature, the merged Sander Thing, for Kate to fight because they thought a big monster finish was needed. If you watch the film, you can spot the seams. The ending jumps quickly to Kate confronting a cartoonish blob creature. One can't help but wonder just how much cooler that Norwegian camp in space ending might have been. Connecting directly to 1982. Stick around through the prequel's credits and you get what we can only call a movie treat. So the filmmakers dovetailed the ending of the 2011 movie exactly into the beginning of Carpenter's The Thing. We see another helicopter arrive at the ruined Norwegian base and pick up Lars, the last surviving Norwegian, only for Lars to start shooting at a fleeing sled dog that we realize is the Thing in disguise. He and the pilot chase the dog in the helicopter, Lars frantically trying to kill it, and this is precisely where the Thing really begins. The prequel's final moments even recreate camera angles of the chopper pursuing the Husky across the Antarctic plain. Poor Lars. We know his desperate warnings will soon be lost in translation when he reaches the American camp. Some things are fated to happen. The helicopter sniper wasn't an actor. In the opening of the 1982 film, the man leaning out of the helicopter and firing at the dog is actually Larry J. Franco, the first assistant director on the film. They needed someone crazy enough to hang out of a flying chopper and shoot at a running dog with blanks, and Franco volunteered to get the shot done quickly. As the first assistant director, Franco was in charge of practical logistics on set, so he literally took the gun up himself. Funnily enough, Franco was Kurt Russell's brother-in-law at the time, though that's likely just coincidence. Keith David's first film role. The Thing was the feature film debut of Keith David, who plays Childs, and until The Thing, he was a New York stage actor. He was cast among a group of older, seasoned character actors like Wilford Brimley and Donald Moffat, and had to adjust his theatrical acting style to more subtle film acting. During shooting, David broke his hand in a car accident and had to wear a glove painted to look like skin in some scenes. Look closely and you might notice Childs keeping one hand in his pocket in a few shots. Keith David would go on to have a prolific career, but he often recalls The Thing as baptism by fire. Learning to hit marks in the snow and act to rubber monsters was a far cry from Shakespeare in the Park. Dark Horse's comic book sequels. The story of The Thing didn't end in 1982, at least not in the comics. In the early 90s, Dark Horse Comics published a series of comic sequels starting with The Thing from Another World in 1991. They intentionally named the series after the 1951 film to avoid legal issues with Marvel's Thing character. These comics pick up right after the film's ending, and yes, MacReady survives. In the first miniseries, MacReady is rescued by a passing whaling ship, and he continues battling the creature at an outpost and even an Argentine base. Child survives too in one comic continuity, though just barely. Over 3 miniseries called The Thing from Another World, Climate of Fear, and Eternal Vows, MacReady faces the Thing in new locations, including the jungles of South America in one storyline. These are unofficial What Happened Next tales, but they're a cool glimpse into how the fight might continue. Interestingly, one later comic called Questionable Research from 1993 ignored the previous series and presented its own separate sequel scenario. Vikings versus The Thing. One of the most intriguing expansions of The Thing lore came in 2011 when Dark Horse released The Thing, The Northman Nightmare. This comic isn't a sequel like the rest, and instead, this one's a prequel that's set in medieval times. The 3-issue story written by Steve Niles takes place in Greenland around the year 1121 AD, where a bunch of stranded Norsemen in a remote village encounter the shape-shifting creature. This book is a standalone tale showing the creature's horrific antics centuries earlier, long before the Antarctic outbreak. In fact, if you want to know the full story of all these comics, just go to our channel and search for The Thing Stories Beyond the Movies. Why From Another World? The Dark Horse comic sequels carried the title The Thing from Another World. Universal had the rights to The Thing for movies. That name risked confusion with Marvel's The Thing from the Fantastic Four. Dark Horse cleverly used the full title of the 1951 film to sidestep any legal issues. So, if you've ever wondered why the comics have such a long title, it was partially to avoid a rocky orange superhero showing up in Antarctica. Incidentally, John Carpenter's film was almost titled Who Goes There originally, but they stuck with The Thing to connect it to the 1950s movie. alternate sequels that never happened. Over the years, there have been off and on again talks of further Thing projects. One idea in the early 2000s was a Sci-Fi Channel miniseries sequel featuring MacReady and Childs, with Kurt Russell and Keith David possibly reprising their roles. Unfortunately, that never materialized. Instead, the 2002 video game became the de facto sequel, or on that upcoming. John Carpenter has occasionally teased that MacReady and Childs may not be as dead as we think. In fact, Carpenter once said he knows who's human at the end, he just isn't telling. But you and I continue to speculate, and the appetite for more Thing stories remains strong, which leads us to the video game sequel was Carpenter approved. In 2002, a video game titled The Thing was released for PC and consoles as an official sequel to the film. In the game's story, a U.S. Special Forces team is sent to investigate the aftermath of the Outpost 31 disaster. They find MacReady and Childs missing, and MacReady is later found alive, and of course, the Thing is still lurking. John Carpenter gave the game his blessing and effectively endorsed it as a canonical continuation. He even cameoed in it by lending his voice to a character you encounter in the game's final act. While the game's graphics are a little dated now, it was innovative for the time, featuring a trust fear system where NPC squad mates might panic or turn on you if they suspected you were a Thing. The game sold well, and for many years, it was the closest thing to The Thing Part 2. Blumhouse is reviving The Thing. As of 2020, a new Thing movie is possibly in development. Not exactly a remake, but a new adaptation of the original story, Who Goes There? Here's the thing though. In 2018, an expanded version of that novella, long thought lost, was discovered and published as Frozen Hell. Blumhouse Productions, the studio behind Get Out and the new Halloween, announced it's teaming with Universal to adapt Frozen Hell into a film. This means the next Thing movie might include material from the novel-length version of Campbell's story that no film has tackled yet. Producer Alan Dawns confirmed the project and emphasized it's not simply remaking Carpenter's movie, but going back to the source with new content. So the franchise comes full circle to its literary roots, and perhaps in a few years we'll see a fresh take on shape-shifting terror, one that might surprise even veteran fans with new old ideas. Tarantino's tribute. The Thing's reputation has skyrocketed over the decades, influencing countless filmmakers, the most notable of which has to be Quentin Tarantino. Tarantino has called The Thing the greatest horror movie ever made and borrowed its DNA for his own work. His debut, Reservoir Dogs from 1992, was directly inspired by the paranoia and suspicion of the Thing's ensemble, a group of men stuck in a warehouse, uncertain who to trust, similar to the Outpost paranoia. More explicitly, Tarantino's The Hateful Eight from 2015 is often viewed as a Western remix of The Thing, with characters snowed in with a hidden betrayer among them. Kurt Russell even stars in it, again dealing with a deadly mystery in the cold, and Tarantino even used Ennio Morricone's unused Thing score to heighten the tension. It's an homage Carpenter himself appreciated. So if you felt The Hateful Eight had a Thing vibe, you're not just imagining it. Mr. Tarantino was wearing his fandom on his sleeve. Pop culture legacy, Stranger Things and beyond. Today, The Thing is firmly enshrined as a cult classic, and its fingerprints are all over modern entertainment. The Duffer Brothers, creators of Stranger Things, are huge fans, and they've peppered their series with references. In Stranger Things Season 1, there's a The Thing poster in Mike's basement, and characters marathon the movie on VHS. In Season 3, Lucas compares an alien slug to The Thing over a can of New Coke. By Season 4, the storyline of Hopper, who gets trapped in a snowy Russian prison with a monster, carries strong The Thing vibes. The Duffers have said that Rob Bottin's practical effects inspired them to use practical creature makeup for the Demogorgon rather than pure CGI. So yeah, anytime you see a film or show with an imposter among us or a monster hiding in plain sight, you can bet The Thing is somewhere in its DNA. What started as a maligned gore fest in 1982 is now recognized as a touchstone of horror and sci-fi. It taught us that paranoia can be just as terrifying as any monster, and also the fact that practical effects, when done with passion and maybe a quart of KY jelly, can be timeless nightmare fuel. The Thing lives on, still ready to spring out and scream in the dark, generation after generation. That's why we love it. But unfortunately, that's all we got in this one, guys. So if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Otherwise, thanks for watching, stay safe out there, and have a marvelous day.